to these lands, waters and skies. Today it is a pleasure to introduce Professor Leila Harris, who will present a seminar titled Infrastructural Inequities and Democratic Countercurrents. Leila is a professor at the University of British Columbia. Her work analyses a range of governance and political considerations from feminist, equity and sustainability perspectives. Her significant research has focused on water politics, governance and justice in a variety of contexts, from Turkey to Ghana, South Africa, and Indigenous water issues in Canada. Her recent work focuses on lived experiences and equity concerns related to the uneven implementation of human rights to water. Ongoing water governance shifts, as well as social, affective and political dimensions of the uneven geography of access to water and infrastructures. Professor Harris is currently a visiting scholar with the School of Geosciences at the University of Sydney, where she'll be until July 2025. We're very fortunate that she's taken the time to visit us from Sydney today. So thank you, Leila. Leila will present for about 40 minutes and then we'll open for 15 to 20 minutes of questions and discussion. Today's seminar will also be recorded and I ask that people put their phones on silent and mute their microphones. So many thanks and over to you, Leila.
Thank you. So we can be a little bit informal, I think, since we're a small group, but I do have a formalish presentation. I'll start by thanking Christina, Kat Taylor, and others who have made my visit today possible, and thank you all for being here. I'll also recognize that I come from University of British Columbia, which is the unceded Musqueam territory, in what is referred to as Vancouver today. And I also want to acknowledge those Indigenous communities and elders here that have long cared for the land and waters in this territory as well. And to also recognize any Indigenous colleagues who might be in the audience today. So I also want to just kind of begin with a reflection on how important these sorts of acknowledgements are for political ecology work of this type, and that many of us do, because we're precisely talking about the expropriation, disenfranchisement, and the politics around resources, lands, and waters. And so to me, these are very important issues to foreground, and I hope you'll see some somewhat less acute, but similar threads throughout the talk, just in terms of thinking through how do we engage with and continue to confront these issues. For my purposes, it's also very critical to acknowledge the ongoing ecological and humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in Gaza as well, because I see these things as all stemming from similar root causes and threads. So I kind of want to start by acknowledging all of those together as we talk about and think through different experiences of injustices as they relate to nature and the environment. So I'll start with the really simple truism that I don't think I have to speak much to, which is that there's an uneven geography in terms of how we access key resources essential for life. In particular, access to safe, affordable, and high quality water and sanitation infrastructure is something that's not shared equally around the globe. We also know, and we have considerable evidence, again, that I don't think I have to speak to in any detail, that this inequity really drives a number of health and well-being inequities around the world. So the key points here is that infrastructural inequities are a key defining feature of our world, and that this contours the geography of health, well-being, and dignity as key aspects that follow from that. So I think we're all kind of familiar in a general sense, even if we're not public health scholars, with how critical these issues are. Of course, water and sanitation is probably still the primary driver of disease and death in the world today. But I want to kind of go for some different angles on these issues that we maybe are less familiar with and that don't kind of come up in the popular imaginary as often. So I want to extend beyond these well-established understandings about how infrastructural inequities affect public health and well-being. And in particular, what I'd like to speak to are 2 points. So here again, I'm moving from the basic environmental justice understanding that this is uneven, and not in a way that's random. It's uneven in a way that's contoured with respect to race, colonialism, impoverishment, and other key contours of inequality. And so we could look at examples and understand how these patterns emerge and why, and how they link to these other types of inequities, as I've just mentioned. So that might lead us to a certain analysis of something like the cholera outbreak in Joburg, or the Flint, Michigan considerations around lead in drinking water, or the Bangladesh arsenic crisis. And all of these have been analyzed through political, ecological, and environmental justice lenses to understand how and why these are patterned, again, with respect to race, coloniality, or other key dynamics and inequities. And that's critical work that I'm going to just, again, establish and move from. So if you want to go back to any of those sort of arguments, we can. But what I want to push towards and spend most of my time thinking through are these sort of, what are the other effects of these infrastructural inequities? And in particular, I'm interested in how this affects social and political lives in different ways, again, some of which are somewhat understood and established, but other things that I think we need to push much more on and theorize much more adequately. So I'm going to be speaking to these dimensions on the bottom of the screen. How does this affect ideas of difference, belonging in communities, politics of citizen engagement, how people engage with and feel a part of those communities, again, perhaps as a direct extension of ideas of difference and belonging, but also how it affects ideas of state building, trust, and legitimacy of government. And again, you can think of the extensive range of governmentality work that has thought about links to state building in more the sort of power dynamics way, but how in the other ways as well do people come to see government as more legitimate or trust in that government entity in relation to these inequities and patterns as we've discussed. And then I want to end with a little bit of kind of linking to democracy theory. And this is where I'm meant to be pushing much more on my research leave. I'm only just getting started, which feels like it's always in that moment. So any ideas on this, I'm particularly welcoming and would be thankful for, but this is where I'm hoping to move us in the talk today. So this is one of the moments where it seems to be stuck.
Yeah.
Okay, so how will I get there? I hope so. I've kind of made a couple little conceptual touch points already. I'll do a little bit more of that, just talking about environmental justice and inequities, critical infrastructural studies, and political ecology as the sort of theoretical currents that I'm moving from and building on. Then I want to spend most of my time, as I said, on what I have here as part 2 and 3, politics and citizens engagement, state society dynamics and trust, and what some of the evidence from the work that we've done in Ghana and South Africa suggests towards those ends. I also see strong connections to the work in Flint, where I haven't worked personally, but where I've read quite a bit, and also on the Indigenous water governance side, especially from the Canadian literature. So I see connections there, but I won't speak directly to those empirics today. And then, as I said, we'll go towards democratic countercurrents, which is referencing the work of Edgar Petirse from the African Center for Cities in South Africa. And I'll speak more to what he says about countercurrents and how it links with my arguments around inequity. You see here a host of names on the bottom of the slide. These are students and postdocs and others who have worked with me on different dimensions of this project. So it's been a long-term project, more than a decade, multiple theses, and that I'm kind of drawing from and thinking through the different dimensions of the work that have gone on. So this is just the Ghana, South Africa team that has worked over the years. So again, just a quick touch point on infrastructural inequities, which is something that I feel like, again, it's well established. We have some conceptual tools to help us think about the why. And the key points here are that often these stem from broader structural inequities such as coloniality, racism, and other things. So we have a number of different points of evidence in terms of how and why we have these infrastructural inequities that have emerged. And to understand what to do about it, we have to also attend to the why. And political ecology in particular has been, I think, really insightful in terms of helping us think through some of those broader histories and processes, or the political economic considerations behind some of these. So again, I'll go fairly quickly, just a couple of touch points here. You see this image from the Nibi Water Song, which is a children's book about Indigenous water issues and infrastructural inequities in Canada. And the point is very basically that we have these strong patterns that have emerged. We can link them in terms of histories of colonialism, in terms of the why and how these have come to be over time. So in Canada, we know 73% of the water systems on reserve communities are considered at higher medium risk in terms of drinking water. This is an ongoing issue, even though there's been pledges multiple times to deal with this. And what's emerged is what is called a two-tiered water system in Canada, in part because of different governance processes that govern drinking water on reserve and off reserve. So let's just look at a couple specific examples, and this is just from the literature in general, that help us understand a little bit more about how does something like class, caste, race, or colonialism linked to and help us understand differential patterns of water quality or access. So this is the work of anthropologist Heather O'Leary. She's done considerable work in Delhi on some of these processes. And I like this example a lot because she's dealing specifically with caste and class dynamics in Delhi. And what she argues in this case is she says that water consumption is a lubricant, social lubricant for class relations. So in essence, one performs sort of higher income status by using a lot of water, maintaining notions of hygiene and cleanliness associated with those caste or class associations. And conversely, someone maybe of lower caste who's not able to access as much water is not able to signify the same sort of hygiene dynamics and relations, and so therefore can experience upward mobility. They might not be hireable for different jobs because they don't have access to the water to maintain notions of cleanliness or perform class in particular ways. So this is an example of how caste and class in particular reinforce uneven patterns of water access and use, and how you can look directly at, again, maintaining the household cleanliness dynamics ends up using more water in this case as an example. But here it's the sort of dynamic way in which caste and class interface with water consumption, particularly. Another example that I really like is this one done by a master's student who worked with me and Gunilla Oberg at UBC, Margaret Morales. And in this work, Margaret went to communities in Buenos Aires that did not have sewage infrastructure. And she initially went with the idea that she would do something around sort of culturally appropriate technology. So you see here the image of the urine diversionary toilet on the right. And she went with a couple different examples that were suggested by engineers about, given the topography and other concerns in these neighborhoods, what might be sustainable sewage solutions. And she went and she asked people in the community, what did they think about these different options? And what kind of surprised her and shifted the tenor and tone of her whole thesis was the way that people responded to her. It was not as simple as we prefer A over B over C, which is maybe what she thought she would be hearing from the community. It was questions such as, is this what you use in Canada for your toilets? You know, and why are you promoting these ideas of sustainability for us that for them signified backwards rural conditions that they had left when they moved to the city? And so for them, they said very pointedly, we know that that's not what other people in Buenos Aires are using for their toilets. We also want flush toilets. And so it was more those symbolic associations, again, around rurality, livelihoods, and class dynamics that people were very important to what sort of technologies or sewage people thought were appropriate for the communities. In essence, they didn't want to accept second-class citizenship as part of what it meant for them, because what they were aspiring to when they moved to the city was to be part of this sort of modern imaginary. And the sanitation dynamics and the ability to be separated from one's excreta was important to those associations. So again, you can think about how notions of urbanity, notions of modernity affect and articulate with sewage infrastructure and what would seem appropriate for different people in the community. Margaret has written about this in other ways as well, building on a lot of other work from anthropology and otherwise, similarly about class, notions of belonging as articulated through things such as sewage infrastructure. And again, ideas around the state were also important here. She ended up doing a short film and the community decided to name that film The Tale of an Absent State. So again, kind of how people think about and understand governments and government entities is something that's materially and symbolically tied to these infrastructures as well. So before I move on to the empirics of the work from South Africa and Ghana, I wanted to mention some of the issues around affect and emotion. And for my thinking, the work of Amber Wutich, also an anthropologist, has been really foundational. And there's been a whole series of works that have her initial works have spawned in the water insecurity domain, at least. And this was based on some of her early work in Bolivia. And what she found was she was very surprised because she had read the literature, then she went and talked to people about water insecurity. And the things that they told her, these are her slides as well that she provided, and that she was not anticipating hearing about, was how worried they were, how angry they were. This mother of 5 said she was fuming for days because the truck driver did not come to sell water. And so these emotional dimensions were not something she anticipated and that she recognized were under-theorized in the literature. So there's been a lot more work since then on how something like water insecurity, or again, I'm going to push more on the unevenness of those infrastructures and how that relative inequity gets interpreted and read through people in terms of the symbolism of that. But here, she really highlighted that these emotional responses were very strong. Over 80% of her respondents said that they'd experienced some of these emotions over the past month. And the other thing that I want to highlight that she found was that there was a gender dimension. Women were more likely to experience these emotions, but that the perceived unfairness and the uncertainty was the biggest driver and most significant, more than absolute water stress in terms of what led to these strong emotions. So you saw that quote about the driver there. It was the idea that tomorrow the driver might not come, or he might raise the prices on you unexpectedly. So it was that uncertainty and the sense of injustice or inequality that really drove people to feel very strongly about this. It wasn't around the absolute water conditions per se, or the quality of the water per se. It was around unfairness and uncertainty. So these are themes that I'm going to be picking up as I now turn to some of the work that the large team has done in urban sites of Accra and Cape Town. So the broader project that I'm drawing from, again, happened over about a decade, really tried to look at the lived experiences around difference and inequities, some of these dynamics around politics and engagements, sense of state legitimacy and trust were core themes. And also we looked a lot at narratives of water insecurity as part of this work. So again, I'm going to go very quickly here, and I'm happy to return to anything people want to talk more about, but these are some of the sites where we conducted work around Accra. These would mainly be understood as underserved sites. So Accra on the whole, only about, at the time, about 50% of the urban population was receiving water through pipe sources. Other people would be receiving water through vendors and tanker trucks and other mechanisms. So these are some of the locations where we did survey interviews and focus group work. And then in and around Cape Town, similarly underserved sites, largely Black townships outside of Cape Town, mainly in Kailicha. We did a lot of follow-up work, and that's what I'll be speaking to today. But we did surveys in Philippi and Kailicha as well at the early part of the project. So just to give you a quick sense, really rapid sketch in terms of some of the things that were going on at the time of our initial survey. So I want to focus for today on South Africa. I won't be speaking as much to Ghana here, but let's just look at some of the sort of general synthesis about what was happening in South Africa at the time. I'll just highlight that you'll see here from the blue, which is agree, that in South Africa, most people, nearly 90%, agreed that it was easy to get water. Most people, over 90%, agreed that the water was of good quality. But there's a drop-off. People were not satisfied. So somehow there's an interesting puzzle here that I'm trying to get at as I speak and move forward through the talk, is what is it, why quality and ease does not equal satisfaction? There's something missing there in the equation, so we then have to start to ask ourselves, why would ease and quality not equal satisfaction? So again, it's still over 60% that are satisfied, which is a relatively high number, I think, and consistent with other data from similar sites in South Africa. Although when you show this to some activists, they immediately say, like, that can't be true. Over 90% can't think it's easy and good quality. And again, we'll speak a little bit to why. Just speaking again to some of the things that Amber's work and the literature in general raises around affect and emotion, you still see that nearly 50% say that they worry about water, even though, again, they say it's easy to access and high quality. So what's going on? So that was some of our sort of quick overview statistical work. And here you have a more qualitative analysis done by Lucy Rodina, who went on to do her PhD with me on resilience in water in Cape Town and now works for the new water agency in Canada. And what Lucy describes here is how people talk again. I said we were emphasizing narrative, how people talk about differential access and what they're experiencing. So South Africa, you might know, boasts a constitutional right to water. And when you look at the Joint Monitoring Program and other statistics, it does have nearly 99% service coverage in terms of the basic statistics. So access to pipes, et cetera, the things that are used in those analyses. But we know that when you talk to people, you get different sense of what this experience actually is and how people understand and experience these infrastructures. So this is just an image from Kailicha, Site C, where we did a lot of follow-up work as well. This is an image of a broken tap. You can also see the housing stock would be mixed between this, which would be considered an informal shack, and RDB homes, which would be a cement home that would be built and provided by the government. So the settlement has interspersed between these different types of housing types. So basically what ended up coming out very strongly in the work that Lucy helped lead in Kailicha was these issues around, yes, people have access to water from a communal tap of the type you just saw when they're not broken, but this doesn't necessarily equate, again, to satisfaction or notions of dignified access. So look at the quote towards the bottom. It says, we're fetching water from that pipe. Children come and play there. People do their laundries there. People do their dishes there. So it's filthy, it's not clean, not hygienic. So you know it's bad. So this is starting to get at, yes, people have access. In fact, in Site C, water is provided at no charge. So very affordable, but you have to queue and you have to deal with these other issues that maybe don't map against notions of dignity and hygiene. Another issue that came out from the work that Lucy led through the interviews, here, the things I've highlighted in bold are these ideas of difference. So the RDP homes would have an in-home tap and toilet. Right next to them would be someone living in the shack who would be using the communal taps and also the shared toilets that are provided by the government, but have a lot of issues with respect to hygiene and otherwise. So what I want to emphasize here is this person saying we are not the same. Some people are in the good houses, but others are staying in the shacks. So this person was particularly protesting against the idea that they should have to pay for services, which is something the government's ultimately hoping and moving towards. But this idea of difference and inequity in terms of the differential access that they wanted to really highlight here. So I'm going to try and shift a little bit. And again, I'm not going to go into an extensive conceptual discussion. I'm happy to talk about any of these literatures or key sources of inspiration in terms of where I'm trying to go with this, if you'd like in the Q&A as we have time. But I'm kind of working across environmental citizenship discussions, infrastructural citizenship, and the state, ideas of anthropological work on states and stateness and political ecologies of states. So some of the citations are here. So let's talk for 1 second about the citizenship stuff. So you might be familiar with the work of Nikhil Anand, who talked about hydraulic citizenship, for instance. And in his work, Focus in India, he says that when water services are not good, the community puts pressure on the government. So he uses this idea of pressure, both in terms of the pressure through the pipes, but also the pressure that one puts on government to access better services. So there's a lot of qualitative work like this that sort of indirectly connects infrastructural inequities to citizenship practices. So what compels people to push and activate for change or to demand better services? So this is a qualitative connection in terms of infrastructures and political subjectivity or citizenship engagement. So we kind of mapped out these different hypotheses, all of which you can see evidence for in the literature, most of it qualitative, most of it based on individual ethnographies and case studies. So just as an example, here in terms of how water access and conditions might drive participation, Anand's work kind of provides evidence for the necessity hypothesis. If you have low access and quality, this would necessitate you to activate for better services. You can imagine, though, the opposite connections might be true. People who have low access and quality might be generally excluded from the community and therefore not participating because of patterns of exclusion. Enfranchisement on the other side, they might have high levels of trust, sense of belonging, and positive views of water services and high participation. Many of us in more developed contexts might fit in this apathy. You have good access to services, therefore you don't engage and participate because you don't have to, right? You can just kind of sit back and enjoy and expect that your services will be delivered. So we decided to look at these different hypotheses, again, most of which are suggested in different qualitative case studies, and to see, do we have statistical evidence for any of this based on the work in South Africa and Ghana in these underserved communities. And again, just for clarity and simplicity, I just want to focus on South Africa here to say that we did find evidence that connection, water service quality did map against senses of and practices of enfranchisement in South Africa, but not access. So interestingly, the patterns were exactly opposite for Ghana. But focusing on South Africa, the point I want to make here is access didn't have any relationship to whether or not people engaged, but the quality of the water did, and people's satisfaction related to that. So another important point, if you're thinking about citizenship engagement in South Africa on water and sanitation, is that there's been this spate of service delivery protests over the past decade and a half or more. Since 2005, you can see on this, so that's going on 2 decades. And these have been increasing over time, and they've been all across the country. And access to services, water and sanitation, but also electricity and other services have been really core to the discourse of what these protests are about. People who work on political engagement in South Africa say very clearly that these have to also be understood as citizen engagement, because this is an important way that citizens do engage around these issues in the South African context through those sorts of protests. A couple other bits of evidence that I'll just highlight, I think in my mind suggests that there's also pretty strong evidence for senses of disenfranchisement among some of these populations that we surveyed. So both in Ghana and South Africa, 88% in South Africa wish they could participate more in community governance when we asked them about that. And I felt like this was important for South Africa again, that 60% of people in our surveys agreed that they felt no one cares about them. So this is to me just general evidence combined with the protests that I just mentioned about this strong sense of disenfranchisement that we were tracking in some of our data about water and sanitation. So let's just recap and say where we've been, because I've gone over a lot of different touch points here. The first was that something's going on where satisfaction is not something that results from ease of access and quality. So there's something happening there. There's a sense of difference and inequity in terms of infrastructure. So you saw that quote of the shack dweller saying how he's not the same as someone who lives in an RDP home because they don't benefit from the same services. We saw that in South Africa, the quality of the water was predictive of engagement in the models that we ran, looking at some of those relationships. I tried to say, given the service delivery protests and also those other little evidence points, there seems to be a strong sense of disenfranchisement around some of these services as well. And even though people have good access to water of high quality, you know, again, we have these protests around water and sanitation as key themes. So I'll get to the why and how I'm thinking about this in just a second, but I'll also just say that's some of the citizen side. What about ideas around the state and legitimacy of the state? So this is an essay by Bridge where he just summarizes some of the connections between resource state nexus, other work on political ecologies of the state, as I've mentioned. There's a lot of work that you're probably familiar with, which has looked more at state and power consolidation in relation to nature and resources. So that would be more in the Foucauldian vein or in terms of how power is consolidated vis-a-vis resources. But there's another smaller sub-theme, and this is early work that I did as part of my dissertation actually in Turkey, which is more around these questions of state legitimacy. And so one of the biggest things that was surprising for me in my fieldwork, and I worked in southeastern Turkey, a largely Kurdish area, which has been the site of contestation for decades prior to this work and ongoing, but not to the same extent now. But that people talked about the state very favorably in terms of delivery of irrigation and other services. So again, this was unexpected for me. This idea that people saw state as being more legitimate as it was engaging through delivery of basic services instead of the military interventions that they were so used to in this region. And so this idea of how do we think about the state vis-a-vis services, and how does this affect how people engage with and understand the state in terms of how it's lived in their lives and how they narrate that. So again, in this largely Kurdish region, but also Arabic speaking region where I worked, people were talking in very positive terms. That was unexpected for me about how welcome that state intervention was in terms of the recent development projects. Similarly, in the work in South Africa that Lucy helped lead, we also saw that people who benefited from RDP homes and in-home tap and toilet talked about the state more favorably and had narratives about themselves more as citizens or more connected to the state in relation to those infrastructures and services. So again, we kind of thought to test that across the sites. And what was important here, again, in very summary terms, was that we did find that trust in government was linked to water services in South Africa. And this was in terms of quality and satisfaction, but not access. So part of my sort of what I'm coming to with all of this work, and I'm giving you a large sort of remit of work, is that human right to water, infrastructural inequities are not about access. It is not about, does someone have access to water to live till tomorrow? But they have a lot of symbolic and material importance that extend beyond in terms of how people choose to engage with their community, how they think about and engage with the state, and ideas of trust in governments, as we saw here in the quantitative work. And again, I've seen a lot of suggestion about some of these, not as much on the trust side, but some suggestion of this qualitatively, but I wanted to see, can we see anything through this statistical analysis? And we did again, but I think it reflects a similar puzzle again. Why would it be related to quality and satisfaction, but not access in South Africa? And this is the why. This is why I think we're seeing some of the data points that I've suggested to you. Why is it that quality and satisfaction are much more important in South Africa as linked to trust and engagement, but access is not as relevant in those models and those analyses? And this is why I think we're observing what we're observing. Because you have the constitutional right to water and sanitation in South Africa, there is a strong expectation that government should be delivering these services, and that this is people's rights to benefit from these basic services in a way that doesn't exist to the same way narratively and politically in Ghana. I can say that as an aside, even though I said I won't speak about Ghana. Furthermore, when the ANC came to power and eventually was elected in terms of the new South Africa, when that constitution came to be put together, there was also the promise that services would be equitable. It wasn't just that you would have a certain number of liters that you could drink to live. It was this idea of equitable services that was really the centerpiece. So this is how we can see that access and quality is not the same as satisfaction, because people know if you're in an RDP home, you're getting easier access and better access, more clean access in the way that they compared it to the hygienic situation of the shared tap. They also know in Kailicha, nearby in the white suburbs, people have much different access again in terms of swimming pools and so forth. So this idea of equitable access is still far from reality, even though, as I said, South Africa boasts the 99% that everybody has access. And again, in this site where we did most of our work, people are not paying for it, so it's free of cost. But until it achieves this idea of equitability, there's going to be lack of satisfaction and political contestation and protest. This is also why I think we see trust as being something that is linked to services in South Africa and maybe not in Ghana, because it didn't come out in the models in the same way. Again, access is not relevant here, but quality and satisfaction are. So the way that I'm trying to understand this is through theories of relative inequity, relative deprivation, and other ideas. So it's about how people compare themselves to their reference points in terms of what their expectations are. So this is very different than just the fact that we have unequal patterns, as political ecologists and environmental justice scholars often emphasize, but how the narrative and political contours come to be to think through these relative inequity dynamics and how those are very meaningful for people, both material and symbolically, in terms of how it affects their social and political lives. So in terms of the how, what is the pathway, whereby I'm theorizing that these infrastructures end up affecting people's social and political lives, I think the relative inequity is a key piece, not just the strict, tap, does it exist? What is the condition of that? And going back to the work that I cited from Buenos Aires and sanitation, I see that as a key theme in all of these examples. Also the work in Flint and around indigenous water governance, as I said, even though I'm not drawing on those examples today. This is a quote from some anthropologists in South Africa, just that speaks to these connections that I'm seeing here that emerge from the data points that I suggested. They said the idea of democracy, rights, and citizenship in South Africa have become tightly tethered to popular demands for access to state services, technologies, and infrastructure. So I think what I'm providing is just evidence of this tight tethering that exists in the South African context that's developed over the decades, especially with the discourse around equitable rights to services. So let's just go back to this foundational point about infrastructural inequities. So what I'm arguing is that these are really critical dimensions of lived experience beyond how they affect public health and some of those basic things that are often emphasized, whether it's from the SDG policy worlds or from our engineering colleagues and others. I think there is evidence that there is a range of social political consequences of these uneven infrastructures, some of which we don't have much data on. We don't have a lot of comparative cross-site data. We have some rich case studies. Most of those are qualitative, but I would want to see more integrated and comparative and multi-sited studies to better understand some of these social political realities that might be linked to infrastructural inequities. To my mind, I think I'm seeing evidence for senses of difference and inequality, that it could affect community engagement, how people feel, as well as the protest and pressure side of that in terms of what motivates people to be engaged in different ways. And from both the Turkey and South Africa work, I have qualitative and quantitative evidence that it is linked with trust in government, and especially on the quality and satisfaction. So this would be in the Kurdish-dominated southeast of Turkey or the data from South Africa. So to me, I take this all to mean that when we talk about something like the human right to water, we really have to have a theory of inequity as part of that. And I'll say further that I think we have to really think through and better theorize ideas of relative inequities and how those come to be. And I see that as the key sort of linchpin in some of this work in terms of the why for some of the patterns that are observed. Going to democracy theory in general, I'm going to sort of say that we've done some work on trust and water with Nicole Wilson and other colleagues, and that we've written up a couple of years ago. And what we saw was both indigenous context in the Flint case and others. People talk a lot. The engineers often want us to convince populations that they should trust their municipal water. What we documented in that conceptual paper, based on a couple of case studies as well, in a way that echoes some of what I've spoken to today, is that people trust their water purveyors not just because of the quality of the water, but because of longer term relations of colonialism, knowledge dynamics, knowledge politics, other things that affect those trust dynamics. So what we argue is that we shouldn't just be trying to convince people to trust their water, but we have to theorize trustworthiness of the institutions and how it's embedded in these broader histories and context, which brings in, it's much harder, of course, but it brings in those broader dynamics around race, coloniality, and other things that affect the trustworthiness of institutions. I'm also seeing here that this question around redress and recognition is really important to theorize more, building from environmental justice perspectives, but bringing more to democracy theory. So Barnett, Young, Ben Habib, and others have stated that to talk about democracy and to think about how robust democratic institutions are, we have to theorize politics around inequity. So this would include what are the practices of redress that are available to communities when they have an issue, concern, or problem. So in South Africa, we see that the politics of redress maybe is through protests and that sort of political engagement. In the Flint, Michigan case, most of the dissatisfaction and concern was because when they had an issue or concern, no one listened to them, right? So it took several years until an engineer came in and validated the concerns of the community through testing, that it was heard at all or taken seriously. So I want to kind of push and think through a little bit more in terms of how do we connect inequity and politics of redress with broader theories and dynamics of democracy. And I'll wager, just in terms of if to the degree that there's a linkage with trust, that this is an important sort of, again, linchpin for democracy theory that we haven't thought enough about and that we have to pay more attention to. We talk about transparency, knowledge and other things that maybe affect democracy, but I think the politics of redress and the dynamics around inequities is something that we have to really foreground much more here. So I'll end with the work of Edgar Petirse, as I said. So Petirse, working on resilience in Cape Town, says, as long as there's key inequities in the Cape Town context, which Cape Town is very unequal, it's considered one of the most unequal cities in the world, all of the progress that's being made towards making Cape Town more resilient is going to always be undercut by those inequities. So they're always going to sort of erode away at the progress towards resilience. And it's a sort of similar argument that I'm making here around democracy. So as long as you have these inequities, these relative inequities, perceived and real, I think they're always going to undercut and take away from the progress towards building democratic institutions in the way that they affect how people engage with the state and with each other, engage with politics, and understand themselves as belonging to their political communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Leila. That was excellent. So we should have a bit of time for questions. I'll bring up the thing